A goldfish has a 9-second attention span. Gen Z and Gen Alpha students have attention spans that are 6 and 8 seconds respectively. You can't expect them to listen actively in a discussion.
Welcome to Toddle School Leaders Project. I'm your host, Cindy Blackburn, and today I'm talking to my friend, Liza Garzonik, all about her R.E.A.L Discussion framework. We bonded over curriculum. Liza was a teacher, and she found that her students lacked the skills to be able to have discussions in classrooms. More so, she found that it was just inequitable, that some kids were performing well and others just were never getting there. So she developed these sets of competencies and real practical frameworks for bringing discussions to life. You're not going to miss this episode, so let's jump right in. Liza Garzonik, I was so excited to meet you at STL and ATL and to have the chance to follow up our conversation here on the podcast. So thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me, Cindy. I'm thrilled to be here and love meeting you as well.
So cool. So you caught my attention. We were just talking about your work and you bring so much passion and excitement to the table. So might you start by kind of setting the stage for us? Who are you and what's the work that you do that you're most passionate about?
So I am the founder of an organization called R.E.A.L Discussion. And at R.E.A.L, we're on a mission to teach discussion skills to young people growing up in today's world, which we know is increasingly tech-centric and polarized, and where I think good discussion is kind of a dying art. And this is a mission of mine. I mean, I've been on this mission as an educator for over a decade. And it began in my classroom. I've actually taught in kind of all three levels, in lower and middle and in upper schools. But it was a middle school classroom where I first realized, wait a minute, the kids in my class don't have the fundamental like social and relational skills they need to engage in a good discussion. And so I said, like, how can I break what's a deeply human skill and truly an art of great discussion into teachable skills for a generation of kids who usually would rather text than talk. So that's what we've been doing for the last decade. And I'm sure we'll get deeper into what that work looks like. But that's kind of my North Star as a human being and as an educator. And also it's the guiding principle of R.E.A.L Discussion.
I just always think the best educational resources come out of that. Like when it's a teacher who recognizes a problem in their classroom and starts to get creative about how to solve it. So could you articulate the problem a little bit more of like, what did it look like? How did you know that discussion skills were lacking? Like, was it fear? Was it like resistance to discussions? Like, what does that look like in a classroom?
Yes. So I think some kind of common challenges that teachers face and that they feel when they have a discussion is one, students are very anxious. And they're anxious for different reasons. But certainly there's anxiety around, is what I'm saying good enough? How am I graded? Am I going to be able to get my voice into the conversation? What if I say something and my peers don't like it and they judge me either now in the moment and respond to me in a negative way, or later on social media or in a digital or social space? And then I think, those are kind of some generic challenges that kids face. But then there are also just like mechanical challenges. For example, for kids who are used to communicating digitally, where if you don't like something that you're engaging with online, you can just X out the tab. You can swipe right. You can speed something up and put it on, 2x speed. So you don't have to listen to the whole thing. In a conversation, if somebody starts saying that's something you don't like, as a human, you have to sit there and you have to show up and you have to listen, and you have to do so in a way that signals enough respect that the other person feels heard, and then you can engage. So it's skills like that. And I think really understanding that for today's kids, there is a foundationally different skill set communicating in person versus communicating online. And so I think often, and even, a decade ago, I think teachers didn't have to help students distinguish between those two modes of communication as much as they need to today. So those are some examples of challenges they face. I would say the other, like two big other, more like a school systems level challenges. One is discussion skills are everywhere and nowhere in schools. Like everybody agrees that discussion skills need to be taught, and they're often part of a cross-disciplinary framework because it's true. Like discussion skills can show up in science, they can show up in literature, they can be in advisory, in SEL. And yet I think because discussion skills show up everywhere, so often there is no dedicated strategy for explicitly teaching them in a single place. And so then school leaders are kind of like, well, who's responsible for this? So I think that at a systems level, that is another challenge that we absolutely see. And then the third challenge at the systems level is we find that our friends in enrollment and admissions, work so hard to get the right students on campus and to create school communities that bring together students from very diverse backgrounds. And yet, then teachers aren't necessarily equipped with the tools they need to help all of these students connect across their differences. And so I think that that's another place where, like, at a systems level, that's a challenge that many administrators see and they know it's related to discussion skills, but they aren't quite sure how to dig in.
Well, what you outlined there is so complex because it's so much culture and the culture of the classroom and student self-beliefs and classroom beliefs and respect, as well as like an explicit skill set. And so I think it can feel a little bit overwhelming, I'm sure, of like this big important thing that we know kids need, but I don't have the culture and I don't have the skills yet. So like, where do I start? So I'm guessing that that's kind of where R.E.A.L comes in. So might you give us a little bit of context of what exactly is R.E.A.L?
Yes. So, thing number one, to back up, I really appreciate what you say there about the cultural kind of prerequisites of having a good discussion and how student self-beliefs play into the skill development and mastery, use of skills in a discussion. I think that's absolutely true. So what R.E.A.L is, R.E.A.L as an organization, we partner with schools to develop customized discussion skills strategies. So the idea is that we will look at what you're already doing and help you figure out where an explicit approach to teaching and assessing discussion skills fits. Almost always, the program we design for you includes three components. So one is professional development for teachers. It's very teachery. Like, I'm a teacher at heart. So this professional development, I would say, is like deeply focused on and helping teachers not just become, increase their ability to facilitate discussions, but actually for teachers to do some self-reflection around why discussion matters to them, and how they're using it in their classroom. So there's PD
And
for
when?
teachers.
And when? Because I think it's like
Yes.
we run into a similar thing with like AI tutors, for example, of like,
Yes.
cool, on board, think this is
Mhm.
great, but it's a whole new way to assess. So
Yes.
where in my unit does it make the most sense to do it?
Absolutely. And like the PD for teachers, to exactly that point, you're reworking a lesson plan.
Mm-hmm.
And we help you figure out where this fits. It's not an overhaul of existing content, and we don't leave teachers on their own to integrate it themselves. We really hold their hand. We partner with them to say, what awesome do you already have happening, and how can this fit in, and really just provide you with a structure to make sure that. I think another thesis at R.E.A.L is that discussion needs to be practiced. I think so often we use discussions as a one-off kind of class activity.
Right.
And so when we're working with teachers, we're really focused on planning a discussion cycle and looking at how 3 formative discussions add up to a cycle and a deeper level reflection. Anyway, so when we work with a school and we're developing a custom discussion strategy, usually there is PD for teachers, there are materials for students, based that are designed to align with research around what we know in terms of like attentional capacity and executive function needs, and how we can help students focus on what matters during a discussion, as well as create evidence of their learning, both for their own reflection and then also for teachers to use in an equitable assessment. And then the third piece for us is actually impact assessment, which is something that isn't often part of an academic program at a school necessarily. And our impact assessment approach is deeply tied to what you hit on, which is that we don't just measure what skills students are building in a classroom. We measure how discussion is feeling to those students, because we believe that if students don't have the foundational sense of trust and of belonging that they need, then it almost doesn't matter whether or not they know how to disagree well if they don't think that when they're speaking, their classmates are listening.
Yeah.
So we really look at indicators both on the kind of affective experience of discussion as well as the literal skill development.
Love. Are those impact surveys connected to schools' larger strategic goals, or is it more your
You
own
got it.
thing?
I think for many schools, certainly US schools, we see a lot of ties between the impact surveys and portraits of a graduate or portraits of a learner, and looking at particular buckets,
Interesting.
and how, you know, how indicators align to what the school has already said that they value. So we work with administrators to kind of map the impact assessment to whatever their framework is, that helps
Okay,
them
leaders.
measure their mission fulfillment.
Today's episode is brought to you by Toddle, your all-in-one teaching and learning platform for K through 12 schools. If you're at the stage where you're ready to really document your curriculum, to measure what matters and assess and have open communications about what students are learning, Toddle is the perfect fit for you. Check us out at toddleapp.com. And now let's get back to the episode. Let's hear that language again, because I think what you said there was so cool of we're finding ways to measure what they value. And I think that is the big question mark right now as school leaders is how do we measure not what's easiest, but what we actually value? And if we have this portrait of the graduate, and we have this mission statement, how might we measure it? And this feels like one really practical strategy for doing that, which is
Yes,
great.
and it's a different kind of data, than what schools are used to collecting, and I think it centers student voice, literally, and I think that matters. We certainly see also in high school that teachers love to share this data back with their students,
Sure.
and kind of choose which pieces matter most given the teacher's instructional goals. But I think that the value of the data is certainly at the administrator level, at the whole school level. This matters,
Mm,
but also at a classroom level. I think this kind of data can be a powerful teaching tool.
very cool. I guess I'm thinking of a school leader this time of year. We're starting to pivot. Like we've got one foot at the end of the year, we've got one foot in the future of next year.
Mhm.
And I might be hearing this discussion and thinking like, "Oh my gosh, it's one more thing to add onto my plate." I might be feeling daunted. So like what would be your case for why this is so worth the time?
I mean, I think that these are such foundational skills that they
Mhm.
unlock success in all elements of school life. And I often think what I one thing that I often think about is the reality that conversation is how school happens. And that essentially, from the minute students show up on your campus to the minute they're closing their computers at night at home, they are engaged in different types of conversation.
Mhm.
And if you are able to create a culture where all students know what goes into a good conversation, they have shared language around that, and then they have a shared skill set that they're practicing, that unlocks so much potential in other areas of school life. And I'll give you an example. Like a lot of people will come to us and say, can you just plug into our advisory program? Or can you plug into our SEL program? And my answer is always no, we can't. Because this is a skill set that is one of the most important skill sets that you are teaching your students at your school. In terms of when
Mhm.
you think about like over a lifetime, what the returns are of being able to have a good conversation. Um, and it belongs in a core academic class where it can be assessed, and it is assessed. It will absolutely be used in advisory, and students will use
Right.
it. I mean, just yesterday, Cindy, I was talking to our faculty advisory board, and somebody shared a hilarious email they had gotten from a parent of a middle schooler using Real Discussion. And the middle schooler had a birthday party. And I think it was like 15, middle school age girls. They were at a pizza parlor. They were supposed to then go roller skating. There was a fire drill at the roller skating rink. The kids couldn't go roller skating, and they had to decide what they wanted to do instead. And
Oh.
apparently, this group of 12-year-old girls said, well, let's just have a reel about it. And they just had a real discussion at this birthday party to decide that what they were going to do is go see a movie. And the mom wrote this note into the teacher saying, they were doing these, they were looking each other in the eye. They were doing all these like different nonverbal communication signals. They respected each other's opinions. And within 15 minutes, they've made a group decision. And so
Cool.
that's an example of like teaching this skill unlocks so much for children. And I think that rather than focusing on something that is maybe a more targeted, but maybe a more targeted intervention, I think something like Real is foundational. It's pretty low lift, but it's pretty high impact long term.
Well, and it's deeply transferable. And I think when we're
Yeah,
looking at measures that matter, like you said, like I think everybody wants to connect. Everybody wants to be able to, when something's bothering them, start that discussion. And it's
right.
so hard, even as an adult who feels like pretty good at that kind of stuff. Like if I run into conflict with my mother-in-law,
Hmm.
starting that discussion can feel so hard. And here you have 12-year-olds doing that for themselves, like chef's kiss.
Well, exactly. And I think the other thing that's so cool is that what we see in our surveys from students is one of the biggest kind of emotional indicators we see is relief. I think they have this sense that they actually want to be in deeper conversation with each other, but they don't know how. And I
Right.
think that teaching real gives them not only, I mean, they're very fast to say things like, we had a 12-year-old reflection from a child in Boston say he was really glad to be learning real because he was going to run for president and he needed
Oh.
to be able to talk about what he was going to change. So like kids are very quick to understand the real world utility of these skills, like in a career sense, in a workforce preparation sense, they get that almost immediately. But I think the short term utility of this makes it so that when a cashier at a grocery store talks to me, I'm not scared. Like that's another reflection we heard. I think that they feel so deeply. These are skills that have purpose beyond my literature discussion about, the giver or, Wuthering Heights or whatever the text might be.
Very, very cool. I love that.
Yeah.
One thing that stood out to me in our initial chat um, was you said that like this is specifically designed around the needs of Gen X and Gen Alpha, and I would love for you to speak to that a little bit more. Like, what do you know about these kids, and how does this speak to their unique needs?
Right. Well, I think as a kind of educational designer, I find myself caught between embracing, discussion like started with Socrates, right? This is an ancient tradition. This is not a new way of learning and it's not a new way of building relationships. So on the one hand, it's like you have centuries of proven tradition and proven practice. On the other hand, today's students have a fundamentally different life experience than what previous generations have had. So, how
Oh
can
yeah.
you design a system that at once, honors the traditional kind of discourse, the role of discourse in education, while at the same time meeting today's kids where they are? And I think a perfect example of this is for me, listening is like we don't often talk about that. Often discussion is all focused on how many times did you talk? Were your points good? What did you say? But listening is actually a key skill and component of any discussion. Well, listening is extremely hard because, like, from a brain perspective, the gateway to listening is attention. You can't listen to something you're not paying attention to. Well, Gen Z and Gen Alpha students have attention spans that are 6 and 8 seconds, respectively. A goldfish has a 9 second attention span. So when we say, so often I think we'll have a norm in our classroom or in our school of like, you need to listen actively, but without actually doing the skill building work of increasing attentional stamina and helping students realize that they need to redirect their attention, you can't expect them to listen actively in a discussion.
Mm.
So I think that there's a lot of emerging generational research around that kind of thing that informs then how we design real. And we design real to have shorter breaks throughout a discussion to teach kids different ways of listening so that they're able to self-monitor and self-regulate and eventually build their cognitive stamina so that they're better able to actually show up in the moments when things are getting hard in a discussion.
It makes so much sense because I'll hang out with my nieces and I see the kind of like the TV shows even now that they're watching. And when I was a kid, I know it was not the highest quality of things, but it felt like there was like a storyline for 20 minutes. And their shows, it's like literally every minute the storyline changes. And I'm like, no wonder they can't hold a conversation. Like, it, is that the main thing you think is just the attention span, or are there other things that Real speaks to in the younger kid struggle?
Yeah, I think of kind of three big categories. So one is attention span, one is technoference, which is a relatively new term that researchers
I've
have
heard it.
coined to describe when technology interrupts in-person experiences.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and I think that again, this relates to teachers needing to help Gen Z and Gen Alpha students learn the difference between communicating digitally and communicating in person. I think in terms of technoference, ways that technology interferes with how they show up together. I mean, one, for example, if you talk to middle and high school age students, so often, if they have conflict, they, from their perspective, they would rather send somebody a message about it asynchronously than address it live in person. Which, as adults, you might be like, yeah, so would I. But their reasoning, I think, is different. As most adults are kind of like, I don't want to deal with it, right? Like, I'd rather just send this and be done. Most of the kids will say, I want my friend to be able to process this in private and then respond to me. It's very much about giving each other privacy.
Okay.
The problem with that is that it robs them of the experience of moving together through a conflict and continuing their relationship in the span of, if you're having a live conversation, you can do that in 20 minutes. If you're doing it asynchronously, it can take days and you can never get to the other side of it. Right. And the other person might even just choose to ghost and not engage. So I think that that's an example of where technological patterns of communication are undermining how we relate to each other in person. There are a zillion other examples of that, but that's one that I find resonates a lot with educators. And then the third thing that for me was just like, if you know how every now and then when you're reading, you like find a framework that just blows your mind and you're like, oh, everything makes so much more sense now.
The golden circle, man. Still.
Yeah, totally. I had this experience with an article I read in The Atlantic a few years ago that mentioned emotivism. And emotivism is a meta-ethical framework whereby you navigate the world believing that if you feel something, it is morally correct.
Okay.
And I saw this and I was like, oh my gosh, this is society today. And I think this is particularly Gen Alpha and Gen Z today.
But I feel, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and adults, certainly. But I think that they don't know any different. I think for many adults, they can point to emotivism wasn't kind of the rule of law like 25 years ago. That wasn't the MO, the baseline way that we related to each other. It is today. If you're 12, you've never known a world where emotivism wasn't hugely present. So I think another way in which, helping students to separate, okay, I'm having this feeling in this moment because of what's happening, and here's how I want to respond. That is an important skill set for academics, certainly, right? It's really easy if you encounter an idea you don't believe in to just throw it out because it doesn't sit well with you rather than investigating it, right? I think you unlock curiosity by breaking through emotivism. So I think that when I think about challenges that Gen Z and Alpha kids are facing, I mean, 3 big buckets are definitely attention span, technoference, and emotivism.
So cool. Well, and you're introducing me to new terms, which I really love. Like, I think, technoference and emotivism are ones I'd like to learn more about. And I think that's like the mark of an expert, is that clearly this is your passion. And so when you're out in the world navigating this, you're like picking up these gems and adding them. And like, that's really cool. It's cool that you're adding to the depth of our understanding of this.
I mean, the best part about this job is I'm just a professional nerd, essentially. I just get to continue kind of hunting frameworks that resonate and figuring out how to bake them into the R.E.A.L discussion programs that we're designing for schools.
Gosh, so cool. The other part to me that really stands out about your framework is that I'm a curriculum nerd, how you are a discussion nerd, and you are very intentional about crafting competencies. And do you call them competencies? Do you call them learning goals? Like, how are you referring to them?
You know what? We use localized language depending on how the school, that's one of the questions that we ask school leaders is, are you using the language competency? Are you saying learning goal? Are you saying, learning objectives? So we really we try to translate it essentially into whatever is the school's like native languages.
Nice. And thank you for calling out that there might be subtle differences between those things, but largely they are synonymous. That having a clear understanding of what we want kids to know, understand, and be able to do, call it what you want,
Hmm.
But like, let's stick with learning goals for this discussion. Let's
Yeah.
stick with competencies. That's just, as long as we're all speaking the same language, then it's fine.
And as long as we're speaking the language of the folks who are going to be doing this work in the classroom day in and day out, like I do
Mhm.
not want language to trip up, to trip up teachers in sitting there and having to say, well, the real competency is, can we match this to the learning object? Like
Yeah.
I don't want that to be the barrier to entry. So that's why we really say that we build customized programs, is it's like, you tell us, and we will, arrange the real framework accordingly.
Cool. What are the core elements of your competencies? Like, how are they organized?
Yeah. So the core elements of the competencies are, we think first about the skills that go into any great discussion, whether this is an academic discussion or whether this is a personal discussion. And depending on age and stage of students, obviously these skills look different, but broadly we think about 4 categories. So the first is R, stands for relating. E stands for evidence. And that again looks different depending on the context of the conversation, but using specific evidence instead of generalities. A is for ask. Asking questions is a critical component of any great conversation and a skill that students aren't often taught. And then listening. Listening is our 4th skill family, and it's something that in most schools stops being assessed around age 8, when following instructions falls off the report card, with the exception of modern languages, and like auditory comprehension, like that, listening in that sense. But we are on a campaign to bring back assessment of listening for children ages 12 to 18. We believe it's absolutely critical. So those are the skills. And then the other kind of way that we think about learning goals is actually classroom routines. And this, again, teachers use a little bit differently depending on the context of their course and their teaching style and which real materials they're using. But generally, we think about, what are the skills that students need for preparing for a discussion? How do students set goals and self-monitor and self-regulate during a discussion? How do they take notes during a discussion? And then how do they reflect afterwards, both in terms of the mechanics of the discussion, but also the content and the kind of active synthesis. And so thinking about those skills, again, will look different depending on the precise activities that are happening in a classroom. But generally, thinking about before, during, and after discussion is a really helpful framework for teachers to start to isolate and make sure they have evidence of the behaviors that they're looking for.
Cool. So is it almost like, if I'm imagining it visually, it's like a cycle of the discussion, and then embedded at each stage of the cycle, there's relating, evidencing, asking, and listening?
Ish. There's a cycle of discussion in that every 3 discussions we call a cycle. And what that
Okay.
means is that every 3 discussions, students engage in a deeper reflection that
Mhm.
involves going back and actually digging into their primary source evidence of what they did in the first 3. They're noticing patterns of their own behavior, of contribution, of growth. So we think of a discussion cycle in that way. The way that the
Cool.
skills fit in is that every child chooses a personalized discussion goal every discussion. And
Cool.
our philosophy is that you want discussion to be more like, I think so often teachers feel as if, okay, we're going to have a workshop on asking good clarification questions or disagreeing respectfully. And then they have a discussion wherein all of the students try to ask
Everybody.
clarification questions or disagree respectfully. But the problem is you can't have a discussion that's all clarification questions.
Or all
So then
disagreement.
all disagreement. So then the discussion falls flat, And so we really
Right.
approach it as every discussion should be a symphony. Kids should be working on different skills at different times. And we believe that learners can control that trajectory for themselves as long as they eventually hit all of the skills. And it's not surprising. You will see, for example, that introverted students or ESL students, English as a second language students, will choose listening as their first goal because it's easier for them. Extroverts will choose listening last. A lot of
Right.
times, students who are high performers or who might be anxious will choose evidence as their first goal because it's something very predictable. They know that they can do it. Whereas
Right.
relating is something that might appeal more to a kid who maybe didn't do all the preparation, but is really smooth in the moment of building bridges between classmates. And from our perspective, that's fine because they're
Yeah.
all going to get to kind of cross training what doesn't come as naturally to them.
Well, and how gorgeous when you're starting to get to highlight each other's strengths of like,
Yeah.
Liza, I could tell you probably didn't do the reading. I could tell. But what you did so well was your empathy and how you could. Did anybody else notice that? Like, it's just such a beautiful way of noticing strengths while also saying, and how might your discussion be strengthened next time
Mhm.
by?
And what's so sweet, Cindy, is that the kids are so cognizant of when it gets to the point in the year where everybody's working on kind of their non-dominant hand, right? Everybody is doing the thing that doesn't come naturally to them. And they do things like the extrovert will start to facilitate and then be like, oh, Cindy, do you want to do this instead? And
Cute.
make space for
We
Cindy
know
to
each
be like,
other's goals.
I think we should move on to discussion question 2 and take a note-breaking break first, and so they
Right.
really create space for each other. And of course, the level of metacognitive engagement that this is promoting is like, that is what makes this so transferable elsewhere. And I think that that's the piece that just feels so, like that's the secret sauce.
Well, and what you described there was beyond metacognition. It was empathy. And
Yes.
we know that empathy sits at the core of so many of our mission statements and so many of our portrait of the graduates. Empathy is this almost assumed quality, and what a
Mhm.
beautiful way to intentionally and explicitly nurture that.
Yeah, I would say to that point, something else that's like a hallmark of R.E.A.L is during R.E.A.L discussion. So I've surveyed a bunch of students about their experience in discussion and learned that note taking was a point of real anxiety for a lot of
Yeah.
kids, because they feel
What
as
do I
if
write down?
they have to transcribe everything, and they're not chunking the information in their brain. So I was like, okay, how can we think differently about note taking? And our note taking instructions that start in elementary school are: you should write down the name of a classmate, you should summarize the classmate's idea that you heard, and then you need to write how that idea changed or challenged your thinking.
Cool.
And what that does is it normalizes that the point of discussion isn't to win, it's not to be told you're right, it's to have your thinking changed and challenged. But more
Yeah.
profoundly, what it does is if you then use those notes for a round of shout outs at the end of a class, whether students
Mm.
are 8 or whether they're 18, there is absolute magic in listening to students thank each other for specific ways that they changed and challenged each other's thinking. And I think that like that is academically very powerful because you're
Mm.
normalizing mind changing as part of learning. You're practicing intellectual humility. But in terms of social relationships, it really can't be beat because it just builds trust and belonging.
It makes me think of my little fifth graders, and that was one of my proudest moments as a teacher. Was we did a math lesson, whatever, kids were justifying their thinking, and one of my students, like unprovoked, was like, I used to think, and now I think because of what you said. And I was like, they're using thinking routines, they're doing it. Like, it was the best.
Yes, and there's no shame in that, right? Like that is
Yeah.
a sign of learning.
If you could
Um,
hear that more, if that discourse was more common, like, because
yes,
with politicians, they say, oh, they're waffling. And you want
right.
to say, well, that's a great thing. They found new evidence and they
I
changed their thinking. Like, yay.
I absolutely, absolutely. So I think that figuring out how to, for me, it's how do we use discussion to promote not just the growth of discussion skills per se, but also all of these capacities that are core to building a healthy school community. And I think discussion really multitasks in that way. Um,
The other part I want to call about what you said there, like in that last little chunk, was
mhm.
like you talked about student ownership over learning goals
Mm,
and that students were choosing for themselves. And I think that's really only possible when success criteria are really clearly communicated. And I think that's another part of what I really like about the R.E.A.L framework is that it's not just learning goals that are teacher facing, that they are explicitly shared with students. So might you just
yeah.
it's my horse, but like, yeah, why is it so important that we have shared, written, clear curriculum?
Right. I mean, from an equity perspective, it's absolutely critical. At R.E.A.L, I believe so deeply in this, Cindy, that at R.E.A.L we encourage teachers to do two different things. So one is actually at the beginning of the year to give children a quiz on the learning goals as if it's a foreign language.
Okay.
And the
Cool.
students have to write out what it would sound like to do a successful relate comment.
Cool.
And what that means is that before you start asking students to try to achieve these, indicators of success, that that they've internalized them. And if
Mm,
the whole class misses, can't really explain why excerpting with editorial is important, then as a teacher, you really need to dig in there before you start expecting kids to demonstrate this live in a discussion. We also are big believers in student facing assessment tools, self-assessment tools. Whether it's checklists, whether it's rubrics, like whether it's kids designing their own personal trackers. Um, because I think that you think about an adult, right? Like
mm.
it is so inherently stressful if you're operating in a situation where you don't know what success looks like.
Woof. Yeah.
And I think too often that's how kids feel, right? It feels like the teacher holds the keys.
The game.
Yes, absolutely. And research bears this out, right? I think all of the research around the importance of competency-based learning from an equity lens says that a really critical starting point to success for all students is demystifying what success looks like. And if
Mhm.
success is not, and this is paraphrasing Joe Feldman's work, but if success is not demystified, then not all students are going to get there. And
Yes.
if you don't take the step of demystifying success, you're actually relying on assumptions that may be inequitable. They may not be culturally appropriate or inclusive. And for me, my dad was a translator growing up. So I was really raised at the intersection of all these different cultures and thought a lot about what happens when two people are trying to communicate but they don't understand the context. They don't understand where the other one's coming from. And I think with R.E.A.L, what we try to do, and this is where that relief sense comes from, what we try to do is say, hey, before we're having a high stakes discussion, let's talk about what goes into the discussion and how we're all going to get there.
Right.
And so I think that like that feels core to me personally, in terms of like what I've seen in real life, but it also aligns to well-established best practices in education at this point.
Beautifully said. Yeah, I think the power of removing assumption from the assessment process and like just the clarity and the peace that that brings. And it just, to me, it feels so straightforward. Like this is how we should be assessing, but it's so hard in practice to pull off every day. And so I think having a framework like R.E.A.L that's just created for you, that is replicable, that is grounded in these ideas, like I think it was Tom Gusky was saying the other day of like, we try to change teachers' beliefs all the time and get them to believe differently. But it goes the other way. Like if you can give them a mastery experience, if they can experience success, then you can kind of work backwards and talk about the mindsets. And I just imagine the ways that this would impact the assessment culture of a school.
Yep. Yeah, we had somebody tell us, we had an academic dean tell us that real feels like mastery in sheep's clothing because it's so, that's not what we trumpet off the hillside, and that's not
Right.
the starting point for why real matters in a school community. And it happens to be the design principle that underlies a lot of the actual program. But that's not our why. And I think that really inviting teachers into the conversation and into the pedagogical change it takes to integrate a framework into your classroom, like having that conversation start with why you're doing it and how it's going to feel and what the kids need is ultimately much more compelling than this is the latest buzzword. And so I'm just
Right.
doing it because of that. The other thing I want to say, Cindy, is to be really clear, like this perspective on equity is hard won for me. I mean, I was a teacher who sat down to grade discussions in my classroom year after year and would feel really queasy, if I was honest,
Yeah.
because I felt like the tools that I was bringing to bear weren't equitable. And what I saw was that the same students in my classroom were successful, discussion after discussion after discussion. And yet I couldn't break through that. And it was in my second, third year of teaching where I really said, I'm a teacher who wants all students to succeed. Right now, discussion is not a place where all students are succeeding. And I need to change. I need to own that. I need to acknowledge that. I need to stop giving these fluffy group grades where I basically, would give a B plus all the time so that it never impacted anybody too much.
Right.
And I need to stop doing that so that I'm able to meet students where they are and get them all to success, acknowledging that success looks different for different kids in a discussion.
Oh, that's so cool. It's
Yeah, but it
such
didn't
a
come out of a
powerful,
vacuum. Like it was, this was, I know that feeling deeply. And I think we've
yeah,
designed to try to help teachers out of it.
it's a powerful example of the power of collective or of teacher efficacy. And so it's just cool to see the fruit that's born from that inquiry and that sense of power. Love it. All right, my friend, last question for you today. What what do you wish every school leader knew about discussion skills and their importance in the K-12 classroom?
Discussion skills are teachable. Thing number one. I think that is, that is a thesis we've been trying to prove for the last decade. Discussion skills are teachable. This is not an abstract thing. The
Mm,
corollary to that is in today's world, every school should have a strategy for explicitly teaching them.
cool.
And when I say teaching, I really mean teaching and assessing, because I believe that is a critical component of, actually teaching something. So discussion skills are teachable, but in today's world, schools need to be intentional about how and where and why they are taught as part of their program.
Love it. Well, my friend, this is very cool. And your passion shines through. And the way that you're evidencing learning is a North Star, I think, in this world of competency and mastery. So I encourage everybody to check it out. And I just thank you so much for your passion and the time and for sharing this with us.
Well, thank you, Cindy. I mean, I feel the same way about Toddle. I think what you all are doing to make learning visible at every level of the learning ecosystem is so, so powerful. And frankly, it's the infrastructure that we've been missing, is a single system that adds, can take evidence all the way from the classroom to the school level, across grades, across classrooms, across subjects. And so thank you for building the infrastructure that programs like ours need to be able to thrive.
Yay. High five.
All right.